At 13 years old, most boys worry about schoolwork or neighborhood games. But in 1941, standing at a railway station in occupied Poland, Arek Hersh made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his life. When his older brother arrived to take his place on a transport to a forced labor camp, Arek refused to let him go. He climbed aboard the cattle car himself. This single act of defiance marked the beginning of an odyssey that would take him through the darkest chapters of the 20th century and against all odds deliver him to freedom. This is not a story of statistics or distant historical events. This is the account of one boy's survival through the Nazi machinery of death, a journey documented in his own words and preserved in the historical record. It is a testament to the human capacity for endurance when confronted with unimaginable cruelty. Sieradz, Poland, 1928. This small town, unremarkable by most measures, was home to a vibrant Jewish community that had existed for centuries. Into this world came Arek Hersh, the fourth of 5 children, born to a family that observed Jewish traditions and maintained tight bonds with their extended relatives. His childhood, by his own recollection, was filled with the simple pleasures that defined boyhood in interwar Poland afternoons, at the park, winter ice skating on frozen ponds, and the pride of singing solos in his school choir. Yet even in these early years, darker currents flowed beneath the surface of daily life. Anti-Semitism was not a Nazi invention, but rather an ancient prejudice that the Nazis would weaponize with industrial efficiency. Arek experienced this firsthand. I was coming out from the school, and a few Polish children shouted at me, "Go back to Palestine," he would later recall. I was born in Poland, a Polish subject, but according to them, we weren't Polish. The arrival of Jewish refugees from Germany in October 1938, fleeing the Polinaxian expulsions, only increased local tensions. These refugees brought stories of persecution that many Polish Jews struggled to believe, unable to imagine that such things could happen in the modern world. They would soon learn otherwise. September 1st, 1939. The German Wehrmacht crossed into Poland with overwhelming force. And the world, as Arek knew it, began to disintegrate. The Hersh family, along with countless others, fled on foot as the German army advanced. They sought refuge first, with relatives in Zduńska Wola, then in the larger city of Łódź, always staying one step ahead of the approaching forces. But there was no outrunning this storm. When German soldiers finally marched into Łódź, Arek witnessed scenes that would be seared into his memory. The soldiers, laughing and joking among themselves, publicly humiliated Jewish men by forcibly cutting off their beards, a deliberate assault on their religious identity and human dignity. For Arek's father, watching these degradations was enough. He made the fateful decision to return the family to Sieradz, reasoning that familiar ground might offer some measure of safety. It was an understandable calculation. It was also wrong. The persecution that followed the invasion was not chaotic, but systematic. The Nazis had perfected their methods in Germany and Austria, and now they applied these techniques across occupied Poland with bureaucratic precision. Jewish businesses were confiscated, movement was restricted, and most ominously able-bodied men began disappearing into the newly established network of forced labor camps. When the authorities came for Arek's father toward the end of 1941, he managed to escape through the door as they tried to seize him. His older brother likewise evaded capture, but the Germans needed to fill their quotas. On that day, 13-year-old Arek Hersh became a substitute for his father and brother. Picture this scene. A boy barely into his teenage years spending the night locked in a police station, knowing that the next day would separate him from everything he had ever known. When morning came and the prisoners were marched to the railway station, Arek's brother was there, ready to take his place. Here was the moment of choice. Arek could have stepped aside, let his older brother board the transport and return to whatever remained of normal life. He refused. The reason for this refusal remains unclear in the historical record. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps it was a misguided sense of duty. Perhaps it was simply the defiance of a child who had already seen too much and decided he would not be pushed aside. Whatever the motivation, Arek boarded that transport, and with it, he entered a world from which most never returned. The camp at Otoczno, near Września, was relatively small in the sprawling network of Nazi forced labour installations, but size offered no comfort to those imprisoned there. The conditions were brutal, designed to extract maximum work from prisoners while providing minimal sustenance. Death from exhaustion disease and malnutrition was commonplace. Arek survived because of luck and opportunity. His assignment to clean the commandant's office meant he worked indoors, protected from the worst of the weather. More importantly, it gave him access to food scraps and the occasional opportunity to steal additional provisions. In the calculus of survival in Nazi camps, such advantages meant the difference between life and death. Many prisoners, equally innocent and equally deserving of life, lacked these small advantages and perished. In 1942, Arek was transferred back to Łódź, but the city he returned to bore little resemblance to the place his family had once fled through. The Nazis had established the Łódź Ghetto in 1940, cramming approximately 160,000 Jews into a mere 1.6 square miles of the city's oldest and most decrepit neighbourhoods. Sealed off by barbed wire and wooden fences, the ghetto became a prison where starvation, disease and despair were daily realities. When Arek arrived, the other ghetto residents crowded around him, desperate for news of their relatives who had been taken to labour camps. He faced an impossible choice: tell them the truth about the death and suffering he had witnessed, or offer them the comfort of lies. Arek chose mercy. He told them their loved ones were alive and working. He could not bear, he later explained, to add to their already overwhelming burden of grief. This moment reveals something crucial about the Holocaust experience. It was not merely the physical suffering that defined it, but the constant moral dilemmas forced upon victims who had done nothing wrong. Should you tell the truth and destroy hope, or lie to preserve it? Should you take extra food that might mean another's death, or starve yourself through misplaced nobility? The Nazis created systems that forced these impossible choices, thereby implicating their victims in the very machinery of their own destruction. August 1942 brought a new horror. Arek, along with his remaining family members, and approximately 1,400 other ghetto residents, were forced into a church in Sieradz on a scorching summer day. No food was provided, no water. The heat inside the packed church must have been suffocating, the thirst maddening. When Arek's mother asked for water, he did what any child would do. He tried to help her. Slipping out of the church, Arek made his way toward the gate, searching for anything that might ease his mother's suffering. There, an SS officer stopped him and demanded to know his profession. In that split second, Arek made another life-altering decision. He lied, claiming to be a tailor. The officer, apparently satisfied, directed him to join a passing group of 150 people being taken to work in the Łódź Ghetto. Arek walked away from that church. His mother, his family, and the vast majority of those 1,400 people were transported to Chełmno, one of the first Nazi extermination camps, specifically designed for mass murder. There they were loaded into gas vans disguised as transport vehicles and killed with carbon monoxide exhaust. Their bodies were then buried in mass graves in the nearby Rzuchu forest. Arek was 15 years old when he lost nearly everyone he loved. He found himself in the ghetto orphanage alone, among thousands working in a textile mill and trying to comprehend an incomprehensible loss. I didn't know what to do. I was on my own, he would later remember. The older people didn't have time for me, so I went out on the street. I sat on the corner and I started crying. I didn't know what to do. Consider that image, a teenage boy sitting on a street corner in a Nazi ghetto, weeping for a family already murdered in a city that had become a prison, in a world that had revealed itself to be capable of bottomless cruelty. Yet somehow he survived. He went to work each day in the textile mill. He found ways to endure. By the summer of 1944, the Nazi Empire was crumbling. The Red Army was advancing from the east, the Western Allies had landed in Normandy, and Germany's ultimate defeat was becoming inevitable. But for the Jews still trapped in occupied territory, this offered no comfort. Indeed, as the Nazis' territorial control shrank, they intensified their efforts to complete the final solution. On August 25, 1944, Arek was deported from Łódź Ghetto to Auschwitz Birkenau. The Łódź Ghetto, which had been the last major ghetto in Poland, was being liquidated. Its remaining inhabitants were sent to their deaths. The selection process at Auschwitz Birkenau has been documented extensively by historians and survivors. Upon arrival, prisoners were divided into two groups, those deemed fit for labour and those to be immediately murdered in the gas chambers. The selection was often arbitrary, based on snap judgments about a person's appearance and physical condition. Children, the elderly, the sick, and many women were routinely sent directly to their deaths. Arek, observing the selection with the keen awareness of someone who had already survived 3 years of Nazi persecution, noticed that healthier-looking people were being sent to one side. When a disturbance distracted the guards, he quickly moved to join that group. This quick thinking saved his life. The alternative was immediate death in the gas chambers that operated day and night at Birkenau. What followed was the systematic dehumanization that characterized the Nazi camp system. Arek was shaved, completely stripped of his clothes, forced through communal showers, and given a striped uniform that marked him as a prisoner. Then came the final indignity. He was tattooed with the number B7608. From that moment forward, the Nazis would not use his name. He was simply a number, a unit of labour to be exploited until death. This erasure of identity was not accidental, but central to the Nazi system. By reducing human beings to numbers, by stripping them of their names, their clothes, their hair, the Nazis sought to transform their victims into something less than human, in the eyes of both the perpetrators and the victims themselves. It was a psychological warfare, designed to break the spirit before the body gave out. After 2 weeks in Birkenau, Arek was transferred to Auschwitz Birkenau, the original camp, where he was assigned to agricultural labour for the SS. His tasks included ploughing fields and fertilizing them with a particular type of material, ashes from the crematoria. These were the remains of murdered prisoners, reduced to ash and bone fragments, now being spread across fields to help crops grow. Arek remembered feeling the bone fragments as he worked the physical remains of human beings who had been alive days or weeks before, now reduced to fertilizer. The psychological weight of this task is difficult to comprehend. Imagine being forced to handle the ashes of people who might have been your neighbours, your friends, perhaps even your family members, while knowing that you too might end up as ashes spread across these same fields. Later, Arek was transferred to the Fishing Commando, a work detail responsible for catching fish from the Vistula River, to be sent to Germany. This was marginally less psychologically devastating work, though the physical conditions remained brutal. Prisoners received starvation rations while being forced to perform heavy labour. Disease was rampant. Violence from guards was routine. Death was a daily occurrence. Yet Arek endured. Day after day, week after week, month after month, he survived in a place specifically designed to kill him. By January 1945, the sound of Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance. The Red Army was advancing rapidly toward Auschwitz, and the Nazis knew they had little time. Rather than leave the camps and their evidence of mass murder intact, the SS began evacuating prisoners westward deeper into German territory. On January 18, 1945, Arek and the remaining Auschwitz prisoners were forced to begin marching. They wore only their thin striped uniforms against temperatures well below freezing. Snow covered the ground. No food was provided. The march lasted 3 days. These death marches, as they came to be known, were designed to kill. Those who could not keep pace were shot by SS guards. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were shot where they fell. Those who tried to rest were shot. The roads were lined with corpses. How does a person survive 3 days of forced marching in sub-zero temperatures without food and with minimal clothing? The historical record offers no clear answer, because survival under such conditions defies rational explanation. Some combination of luck, willpower, and the random chance of not being selected for execution by the guards allowed certain prisoners to reach the end of the march. Arek was among them. The survivors arrived at Katowice railway station and were loaded onto trains bound for Buchenwald concentration camp near Weimar, Germany. Buchenwald, though not an extermination camp like Auschwitz, was nonetheless a place of tremendous suffering and death. Arek was placed in a children's barracks, a segregated section for the youngest prisoners. On April 7, 1945, with Allied forces closing in on all sides and the Nazi regime in its death throes, Arek and approximately 3,000 other prisoners were loaded onto open railway wagons. The SS guards, even in the face of imminent defeat, continued to inflict suffering on their prisoners. The journey lasted a month. Consider that timeline: 30 days in open wagons, exposed to the elements with minimal food and water, while the guards and railways struggled to navigate through a Germany in chaos. Combat zones, bombed out rail lines, and the general collapse of infrastructure meant the train frequently stopped for days at a time, leaving prisoners trapped in the cars without provisions. Of the 3,000 prisoners who began that journey, only 600 survived to reach their destination, Theresienstadt, a camp in Czechoslovakia that the Nazis had cynically presented to the outside world as a model ghetto, while using it as a transit point to Auschwitz. On May 8, 1945, Arek Hersh was liberated by the Red Army. Victory in Europe Day had arrived. The war was over. He was 16 years old. He weighed perhaps 70 pounds. He had survived Otoczno, Łódź Ghetto, Auschwitz Birkenau, Buchenwald, a death march, and a month-long death transport. The number tattooed on his arm would remain there for the rest of his life. He remembered being given rice pudding to eat by his liberators. Liberation brought its own challenges. Arek had no home to return to, no family waiting for him, no community that remained intact. The world he had known before the war was simply gone destroyed as thoroughly as if it had never existed. Sieradz's Jewish community, which had flourished for centuries, had been annihilated. Of the thousands who had lived there in 1939, only 40 Jews survived the Holocaust. Most had been murdered at Chelmno. Arek lost 81 members of his extended family. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, an entire family tree cut down. From his immediate family, only his elder sister Mania survived, having fled eastward into Soviet territory with relatives before the Nazis could reach her. But Arek's story was far from over. On August 12, 1945, he was transferred to Prague and then flown to Britain as part of a remarkable humanitarian initiative. The British government, working with Jewish relief organisations, agreed to accept 300 young Holocaust survivors, mostly orphaned teenagers like Arek. These young people were brought to Windermere in England's Lake District, a location chosen for its tranquil beauty and distance from the devastation of continental Europe. The Windermere Boys, as they came to be known, arrived in a country that had been spared Nazi occupation, where food was available despite rationing, where people were not trying to kill them simply for being Jewish. Arek recalled the overwhelming surprise of Britain's quiet landscape and the hospitality shown to these traumatized teenagers. It was as if we had been taken to another world, he remembered. A friendly world, a beautiful world. After everything we'd been through, we could not believe it. At Windermere, the survivors began the long process of recovery. They learned English. They received medical care and proper nutrition for the first time in years. They began tentatively to imagine futures for themselves. But the psychological wounds were deep. These were teenagers who had seen things no human being should ever witness, who had lost everyone they loved, who had been reduced to numbers and treated as subhuman for years. After Windermere, Arek moved to Liverpool with other rescued teenagers to learn a trade. He trained as an electrician, a practical skill that would provide him with a livelihood. He married and had 3 children. He built a life in Britain, becoming part of the fabric of his adopted country. On the surface, this was a story of successful integration and recovery. But beneath that surface, the trauma remained. For decades, Arek did not speak about his experiences during the Holocaust. He suffered from regular nightmares, the past intruding on the present in the darkness of night. The memories were too painful, too overwhelming to articulate. 2 years after the war ended, Arek was reunited with his sister Mania, who had made her way to the United States. This reunion must have been bittersweet, a connection to his lost family, but also a reminder of all those who were gone forever. It was not until 1995, 50 years after his liberation, that Arek finally found a way to begin telling his story. He wrote a book titled A Detail of History, composing it slowly and painfully, just 2 lines per day. This pace reflects the difficulty of the task. Each sentence required him to revisit memories he had spent decades trying to suppress. The title itself is significant, A Detail of History. Arek understood that his experience, as extraordinary as it was, represented just one story among millions. 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. Each had a name, a family, a life before the Nazis destroyed them. Arek's story was one detail in this vast historical crime, but it was a detail that needed to be preserved and shared. After writing his book, Arek began speaking publicly about his experiences. He visited schools, community groups, and Holocaust memorial events, sharing his testimony with people of all ages. His purpose was not merely to recount the past, but to educate about the dangers of intolerance and prejudice, to warn against the forces that had nearly destroyed him and had succeeded in destroying so many others. In 2009, the British government recognised Arek's contributions to Holocaust education by awarding him an MBE Member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. It was an honour that acknowledged not just his survival, but his decision to transform his suffering into something meaningful, to use his pain as a tool for education and prevention. Arek Hersh's story matters not because it is unique, but because it is representative. His experiences mirror those of countless other Holocaust survivors, each of whom faced similar ordeals of persecution, deportation, forced labour, and the constant proximity of death. Yet each survivor's story is also unique, containing specific details and moments that illuminate the broader historical reality in ways that statistics never can. Historians debate the causes and mechanisms of the Holocaust, examining economic factors, political ideologies, military circumstances, and cultural prejudices. But individual testimonies like Arek's remind us that behind every historical event are human beings who lived through it, who made decisions in impossible circumstances, who suffered and endured and sometimes survived against all odds. The Holocaust was not an abstract historical event. It was the deliberate murder of 6 million people, each with their own story, their own family, their own dreams that would never be realized. Arek survived to tell not only his own story, but to serve as a voice for those who cannot speak. His parents murdered at Chelmno, his siblings lost to the Nazi machinery of death, the 81 family members whose lives were cut short, the hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews who shared his fate but did not survive it. Today, the number of Holocaust survivors still alive continues to diminish with each passing year. Soon, within the next decade or two, the last living voices of this historical catastrophe will fall silent. When that happens, the responsibility for preserving and transmitting these stories will fall entirely to historians, educators, and institutions dedicated to Holocaust remembrance. This is why survivors like Arek Hersh dedicated their later years to testimony and education. They understood that their personal memories would soon become historical documents, that their lived experiences would transform into archived testimonies and recorded interviews. By speaking out, by writing their stories, by engaging with young people who had no direct connection to the Holocaust, these survivors worked to ensure that the lessons of their suffering would not be forgotten. The lessons are straightforward, but profound prejudice can escalate to genocide. Democratic societies can collapse into totalitarian nightmares. Ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil, and the international community's failure to intervene can enable mass murder. These are not abstract historical lessons, but urgent contemporary warnings. Anti-Semitism did not end with the Holocaust. Genocide did not stop with the Nazis. The forces that enabled the Holocaust still exist in various forms around the world today. Looking back across Arek Hersh's life, We return to that moment at the railway station in 1941, when a 13-year-old boy refused to let his brother take his place. It was a decision born from impulses we can only guess at: defiance, duty, stubbornness, love. It was a decision that led him into years of unimaginable suffering. Yet it was also a decision that led ultimately to survival. Against all odds and rational expectation, Arek Hersh endured everything the Nazi system could inflict upon him. He survived when millions did not. He built a new life when his old one had been completely destroyed. He found the courage to speak when silence might have been easier. And in doing so, he transformed his suffering into something with meaning, his survival into an act of testimony and resistance against those who had tried to erase him and his people from history. The boy who refused to step aside that day in 1941 became a man who refused to let the world forget what had been done. That in the end may be the most important detail of this particular history, that survival is not merely about staying alive, but about bearing witness, about ensuring that the dead are remembered and the lessons of their deaths are learned. Arek Hersh's story is a detail of history, but it is a detail that illuminates the whole, a single voice in the chorus of testimony that keeps the memory of the Holocaust alive and warns future generations about the darkness that human beings are capable of creating and the light that some against all odds managed to present.